All right. Good morning, Dr. Richards. How are you this fine Sunday morning?
I'm doing good. I'm going to the Sixers later today. Looking forward to
Nice.
that.
Who they playing?
We're playing the Wizards, so I heard
Okay.
Embiid might be sitting out, but either way, it'll be fun.
Load management.
Yeah, load management. How are you doing today?
I'm doing good. Had a nice day in New York City with the family yesterday. Saw Aladdin on Broadway. Had some Korean food in Koreatown. So
Love it.
recovering a little bit from that
Yeah,
food explosion, but no, it was a good day. It was a successful trip. I didn't know how it would be to drive into the city. And I found Spot Hero, and it's a game changer, right? You pay for your parking ahead of time, you know exactly where you're going to go, and it's smooth. So I didn't really hit much traffic, so
is it
couldn't
just
ask
like
for anything better.
is it just like in garages or lots, or how's that work? Spot Hero.
It's for what I've used it so far. I think it's only been garages, but you can price compare and you can get really good deals, and it's once you pay for it, right? Like it's really simple. Like exactly where you're going, and I never realized that was such a part of the hassle of going into like a big city. Is that when you get there, you might panic if you don't know where to park, but if you already know where
Yeah,
to park, it's like, oh, okay, like yeah, there might be a little bit of traffic, but it's usually not that bad. Like you're just pulling in, you've already paid for it.
yeah, that's easy.
It makes it much easier. It makes it easier to leave too. It's
Oh, I'm sure.
you know exactly where you're going to be, and you can put your parking spot right next to that. So
Yeah, it's nice.
it was a nice smooth trip.
I'll start using it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's many competing apps too.
Yeah.
Just something I just recently discovered.
Mm.
All right, so today we're going to continue on our discussion of the markers of control for the movement continuum. This would be the fourth marker of control. We'll talk about impact control today. And this is should be a quick conversation, but doesn't mean it's not an important conversation. I think impact control is actually one of the best ways to assess movement control, and it's really important for clients. Again, it becomes very meaningful just because I think it becomes very obvious when your impact control is not sound that the movement's not quite safe yet, and it's time to regress. But it's also a nice cue to just give people a little bit of awareness of their impact control. It could be a really easy way to clean up movement.
Mhm.
So the way that I think about impact control, we can just think of this as landing a movement. That's a general way to look at it for most exercises. And I usually put that into four different categories. Number one being eccentrically controlled landing, and it's a broad term. Like most landing, all landing has some type of eccentric control to it. But the way I'm looking at this specifically is if we just had somebody do something like a squat or even a push-up, there's the coming up and then there's the going down. How do you control the going down? Usually when I'm looking at this, it's can somebody lower themselves down slowly to a contact point and do that in a way that they can pick up the speed eventually, but do they have control when they're making contact with some point? So sitting into a chair is the most obvious example. Do you collapse into that chair? Can you sit down really slowly? So a lot of times I'll give the cue, sit down as slow as you can, try to sit on an egg as if you were sitting on an egg and not cracking it or something like that. But some type of cue for soft contact. And that's usually the easiest place to start anybody. And that could be, someone that's brand new to exercise, but it can also be for somebody who's powerlifting and you just want to see them getting a little bit more control on the way down in a rep. So maybe it's a box squat with load and just say like tap your butt to that box, but don't collapse into it. That could be useful to just have them kind of work through some of that eccentric control on the way down. The second category would be fluid landing. And fluid landing is, the best example of this would be walking or different versions of locomotion where we're traveling forward. So you could think about traveling forward as the object is to move forward. So the contact with the ground we want it to be minimal as down through the ground, but we want it to sort of be a constant fluid motion forward. So the idea here would be there has to be some type of locomotion in a direction, right? And we don't want that direction to be too down into the ground. We want it to be constantly traveling forward. So we could talk a little bit more about that, but that is oftentimes how I will show people gait, or I'll deconstruct their gait and say, how much are we going into the ground versus how much are we traveling forward fluidly? And sometimes that's just a concept that is obvious when it's stated, but most of the time you're seeing people taking really long strides with gait because they just want to get from point A to point B quicker, and that seems to be the most efficient way. But when you deconstruct gait, you see that a lot of times these long strides just drive the foot down into the ground. So just cueing the idea is like, is that really the intention, or is the intention to move forward? So we always want the body to be traveling forward. So a lot of times that's going to decrease the stride length, increase the cadence of the gait cycle. And this could be the same thing for running or any type of forward locomotion. So fluid landing can be quite useful. Tai Chi type movements tie into fluid landing a lot of times, where, the body is moving into the ground, but then there's always another direction that's being shared. So like we're never going straight down with much effort or much vigor. It's, the body is constantly moving in a fluid manner. And then similar to that would be shared landing. But when I think of shared landing, it would be more of a higher intensity movement, more of a direction forward, like a broad jump or something like that, where it's obvious that the direction is going forward. I'm going to be coming down into the ground, but so I don't lose balance forward, I have to share the direction of that movement by maybe getting my hips back, getting my arms back, because otherwise the momentum forward is too great and I'll fall into the ground, or I'll hit too hard into the ground. So sharing the load with joint motions in other directions would be what shared landing is. And then the last category I'll look at is elastic rebounding, which starts to tie into performance a little bit more. This is the idea of like a plyometric, where the object is to spend less time on the ground. So we might do a drop step or a drop jump where we want to spend as little time on the ground before we jump back up and go into a certain direction. Or a box jump, we start on the box, we tap down, get right back up. So we're assessing how quickly can we change directions, but how little time do we spend on the ground? And we're not trying to make that as effortful as possible in our muscles, but trying to let the elastic energy of our muscles respond. And a really common example, this is a good assessment process, is a triple jump versus a broad jump, right? So if a broad jump, I'm just jumping as far as I can one time forward, but a triple jump, I'm asking for elastic rebounding or elastic energy so that each one of the triple jumps moves me forward. So my triple jump should be more than 3 times my broad jump if I'm using elastic energy well. And that's something that the people at the functional movement systems, when they came up with their fundamental capacity screen, that's what they used to assess impact control. So that's my long-winded way of just giving some structure to impact control. What's been your experience so far? How do you use it with clients and athletes?
I look at it a similar way. I think I've, like, in my head, used different language and kind of broken it down by, for me, it's been helpful to just think of it as like, I don't know who started this term, whether it was Bill Hartman or whoever, but this idea of yielding, which would be sort of going with movement, more generally, kind of absorption or the loading phase of movement, and then the overcoming phase or the unloading phase where you're actually trying to come back out of it. And then in the middle, you sort of have that isometric, how do you pronounce that?
Amortization?
Yeah, I can write it on paper, but I never actually get it. I swear I have my degree.
Yeah, periodization is that word for me. Like I just tried to say it 3 times there and I had trouble. Periodization. Yeah.
But yeah, so I kind of look at it generally from that yielding and overcoming phase, and which one I kind of need to bias more in a certain person. But I think if I break it down, it ends up looking more and more kind of like those 4 categories you described. But but I found just like regardless of client, I think it's been easy for me to explain that sort of process for them. And then when working, especially like with an athletic population, it becomes easy to see. Actually, it doesn't matter the population, but like it becomes pretty easy to see those people who are pretty stiff and who can, probably move weight all day in some cases, or in some cases you have people who are deconditioned or weak and stiff. And in either way, you probably really want to work on that yielding phase, that ability to load the system, and actually go with movement, sort of let gravity win temporarily. And then with everyone, you're going to need to work on reversing that and unloading it. And especially think about some people who have less history in strength training, or any type of like quote functional training, getting up and down from a chair, anything like that. Being able to work through the whole phase is really important. But I think just having that system, whether it's yours, those 4 categories, or just 2 categories or whatever it is, being able to break it down helps you better analyze the movement of the person in front of you, so that you can then kind of give them fill the empty bucket that they're missing, regarding impact control. And, I'm curious for you, like when you're breaking this down and working with clients, are these all kind of blending into one another? Do you have specific assessments or exercises that you're kind of looking at when you start with a client on these, or does it all just blend into and bleed into, your general assessment of movement?
It definitely is integrated with everything. And I think, if you look at impact control and the other conversations we had about positions, transitions, postural control, the impact control is just a manifestation of all of those categories, right? So if we're talking about something like elastic rebounding, or even just change of direction, agility work, right? Like that's going to by nature be a little bit faster at its end game. Like that's what we want to see. But if we're seeing that there's poor impact control there, we're going to have to slow it down and have people understand the positions that they can't get into, or that they need to get into to be better at the end game of being able to rebound a little bit better, because positioning really matters for being able to put your muscles in a place where they can be elastic, right? So if your body orientation is way off, then you're not going to, it's not about just like a single tendon that needs to be elastic. It's about the whole body, the fluid within the body that needs to be stacked in a certain position that could absorb, or yield in the right way. So all of these things are interrelated, but impact control is one of those things I think for the client, it becomes really obvious, where like if you can show them and you feel like the exercise you're about to demonstrate, you have good impact control, or you can demonstrate that elastic rebounding, and then they try to do it and it just doesn't feel the same. It sometimes becomes like, okay, what do we have to work on there to make that a little bit better for you, right? So let's slow this down. Maybe instead of doing some type of jumping motion, maybe we just do like a little bit of a bounce. Like there's still this regression in this continuum that we're looking for to see how they can get this impact control better. But I do think it becomes decently obvious to the client when you point it out that there's something different there that's worth working on. Because a lot of clients with pain or some type of history of arthritis, or at least a mentality that arthritis is part of their problem, they understand that weight bearing or heavy loading into the ground can be unsafe. So using some type of cues, like we don't want to slam into the ground, we don't want to make a lot of force down into the ground. It would be better for your joints if we're not having that type of poor impact control. That's something that really gets buy-in from a lot of clients to slow things down, because they can start seeing like, oh, that's a problem. I do want to work more towards putting less load into my joints. So all of these things I think get interrelated, but a lot of times what you have to do when there is not a non-desirable impact control, you have to slow things down. You have to go back to the positions, or you have to slow the transitions down, which looks a lot like eccentrically controlled landing. I think we talked about that with our transitional continuum, where like one of the first things we'll look at is, can someone eccentrically control movement, right? Can they slowly transition on the eccentric, because that's usually easier to work with than even the concentric. So all of that, is really interrelated to everything else that we've talked about and we're looking at. I just think this is sort of like an end game for people. It's a slightly different discussion, but it also is just fitting right into when we start taking a position and transitioning it, we have to also look at impact.
Definitely. I think I've also found it to be helpful, not only just slowing it down, but also sometimes if the goal is to like get people moving faster, then just helping them unweight in certain ways so that they can kind of feel that speed and what you want it to look like. And I mean, then you can kind of train things from both ends of the spectrum, with slowing things down on one side to work on the actual eccentric controlled landing of it. But then also just working on the fluidity. And I guess that would, in a way, kind of talk to your idea of fluid landing, even though that would be more moving forward, but being able to kind of fluidly redirect force without feeling like that big bump or whatever it is on whatever movement you're doing, whether it's walking or even squatting.
Yeah. With walking, there's usually two things that I'll look at with clients broadly. It's just I'll have them do a slow walk, and the slow walk could be, depending on how bad balance is, it might just be static positions that I'm having them just shift back and forward into. So 3 positions I'll look at with walking are a stance phase, a heel strike, and a rollover. And basically it's just, if I get people to do that the way that I want them to, their bodies are sort of always stacked head over pelvis over one leg, right? So if it's in the stance position, basically you're just standing on one leg, your head is over your shoulders, over your hip, is over the leg that you're standing on. When you're in the heel strike position, you still have that position stacked, but you just bring the other leg forward so the heel makes contact with the ground. And then the rollover position, your body has shifted forward, and now you have that stacked weight over the front leg, and you've just rolled over the back toe, the ball of the big toe on the back foot. So when those positions are done well, it's very obvious that what the stride length should be. If you overstride, you're not going to be able to maintain that stacked posture when you shift from the heel strike to rollover, or it won't be reversible. I won't be able to shift. I should be able to shift my body forward and back as easily as possible. So that's where I can kind of get people to understand the purpose of where I want their stride length to be. And oftentimes it's quite a bit shorter than it is for them typically. And then people can't walk that slow all the time. So I might take those positions and just have them, really transition slowly with them. And when they do that, when they transition really slow, it's very obvious that they're not making a lot of heavy contact into the ground. But it's also very obvious how much balance plays a role in that. So you might need to give walking sticks some type of support, right, to offload them, just like you were saying. So I'll give them like the hiking poles. Those are my favorite things because it doesn't feel like you're using canes or a walker. It keeps you upright. You only need to use them as much as you need to use them, but you can use them, to help. And they're very necessary early on for many people. But once that slow walking process is feeling pretty good, you have to have different cues for when you walk faster. So now I'll switch it to, let's take the sticks away. You won't need the balance as much, but now it's a quick and light drill where I want you to think about, keep the head stacked over the hips, lead with the belt buckle. And I may even just guide people from the hips, just push them and just go with my guide, but think quick and light. So that's going to shorten the stride than what they're used to. And the idea is that there's a constant movement forward. Yeah, I'm pushing them forward. They're going with that. They're not resisting it. If you take a longer stride, you're going to break that posture where your foot will be out in front of you. Now your body has to come back over that foot as it goes forward. So there's this sort of braking mechanism that's constantly happening. Foot goes out in front of you. You have to slow down, decelerate till your body gets back over it, as opposed to thinking of the quick and light would be your body's always staying stacked on top of each other and you're just constantly falling forward in a way that, just is more ideal for posture. That will naturally lighten the load into your landings. And people can feel that. It just doesn't always feel natural.
Yeah.
But I think it is important to be able to do both. So before somebody leaves, after doing a slow walking drive, make sure they get a little bit of time just with the quick and light stuff to just say, like, no, you don't have to just walk slow all the time, but here's how the slow goes into the fast.
Yeah.
And that to me is all that fluid landing conversation, right? Where you can get that sense of feel. If you're doing it slowly, it really does feel very fluid. Like I got this drill from practicing walking meditation and things I've done with meditation over the years. And you're really just trying to get into your body, just like you would get into your breath. You feel yourself breathe in, breathe out. With walking meditation, it's like, okay, I could feel my heels strike the ground at this moment. I'm rolling over to my foot at this moment. My body's shifting. Whatever you perceive, you're very mindful of every part of the gait cycle. But one of the things you realize is if your balance isn't terrible, you're going to land very light into the ground. And that lightness into the ground is very soothing and relaxing. So then it becomes like, okay, how do I speed that up? Well, I'm always moving forward, right? So I have to think about how do I cue my body to move forward, not down, right? So that's, those two work together. But the stimulation, relaxation response is going to be very different depending on, how it's being trained.
Will you ever use cadence with people, like put on a metronome or like music to a certain cadence? Yeah.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I did that a lot more at first with running. I've gone through the pose running certification and all that, and they do a lot of work with that. So I have all these running drills through that I would put the cadence on, like quick pulls and trying to get people closer to like a 180 beat per minute or step per minute type of thing. But then I started doing that with walking just to experiment with like what would be a good cadence there. So it was like, bring it down from the 180, which would be for running. And sometimes I'd, get people to like 130, 140, but it would be like find their baseline, gradually up it. And I can't say I do that as much anymore, but I do think there was some utility there. It's just now like I'll just be more use my hands to kind of guide them a little bit and just go with the flow. But there's times like if I just feel like that's not working, those cues aren't working, having a more objective way of doing that, the metronome works quite well.
I just discovered on Spotify, you can just search whatever beats per minute and it comes up with a playlist of all the songs. Yeah, I literally just discovered that this week. But what have you found in terms of overall walking speed when you get clients to switch towards that more frequent stride length versus like a longer one that they probably come in with where there's like that heavy braking force and kind of re-acceleration every step?
So what would be the like beats per minute on a metronome, or what would be the speed?
I'm saying like meters per second when you get clients to sort of more so abide I'm saying you have a client come in, they demonstrate some limitations in their impact control specifically to fluid landing. You start working on more of that light, quick walking. What is that? I'm just curious, like I would think that makes their top walking speed probably higher and they end up being faster, but I didn't know if that's something you looked at. I
don't measure the meters per second with the gait, but it definitely does feel faster for them. And it also takes it's a different type of conditioning too. Yeah. Right. So it's not necessarily less effort, it's just different effort. That's what I found. So and we can think of this as like any type of training where we have to hit the ground harder. It doesn't always feel like hard work, but your body is responding to that, and your muscles are working harder, right? Like your joints are working harder, but maybe cardiovascularly, you're not feeling it in the same way, right? Yeah. The muscles aren't getting fatigued in the same way. And, anything that's new to the body, there's going to be a different sensation of conditioning. So that's the response I get a lot of times, where it feels like, okay, if I were to sustain this increased cadence, it's going to feel fatiguing, but it'll feel fatiguing in a different way than, taking the pounding into the ground would, right? But you get used to what you're doing, and you don't necessarily connect the dots to, okay, this way of walking is the reason my knee hurts when I walk, or the reason my ankle hurts when I walk, right? So that, again, this is where all of the stuff we've talked about is well integrated, right? So if pain is our number one marker of control, as soon as we slow walking down, and if it's pain with walking, we can find out like when exactly does it hurt during walking, right? And that's a conversation that, sometimes it's people they'll just, it just hurts when I walk. And I'm like, all right, well, I'm not going to argue. Let's just slow walking down. And this is my version of the way I want you to walk right now. And as we do this, just tell me what you're feeling, right? Tell me it hurts. Okay. At what point? And let's backtrack. Like sometimes I have to backtrack where it's like, it hurts when I walk, but I want you to backtrack and hold a position, stop at the moment that you feel the pain. And that's difficult for people because they're not used to thinking of walking like that, right? It's the same conversation we've had about breathing, where it's difficult to change someone's breathing because they're not used to thinking about breathing as something that is voluntary as much as it's involuntary. And I think walking has a lot of similar things. So, but if we can separate out, like, where's the onset of pain within the gait cycle, it becomes pretty obvious that it matters how you walk. It's not just pain with walking. You can change the pain by walking slightly differently, right? And a lot of times if I get people to do that slow walking, they don't find the pain when they walk slower. So right away it's like, okay, well, maybe it doesn't hurt all the time if I'm doing this, but and then the conversation is like, I would never walk this slow. So that's where you have to have a progression and to say, okay, here's how we take what we're doing here slowly and make it a more practical, functional walk. And that's where, you blend it right into the quick and light. So pain becomes that best feedback, that best buy-in to say, okay, you're not feeling the pain as much here when we do it this way. How do we get you to do that a little bit more? And then it feels like conditioning, right? So it's like, okay, I have to do these short bouts of quick and light walking in a hallway until I feel fatigued or I feel like I can't maintain this impact control, and then I'll sit down and I'll do it again, right? And that becomes a program like interval training. So you got to connect the dots to other things that people are aware of. They might be on an elliptical, they might be on a bike, they've heard of interval training, but they don't think of it with walking, right? Like walking for a lot of people, it's just I go out and I walk. It's about distance. It's about social engagement. All that stuff's important. But when there's pain, right, like you have to be able to backtrack and then fit it into the continuum of things that they're already familiar with, but just do it for the thing that they're actually complaining about.
Yeah. Yep. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But, as far as speed's important. But I don't measure gait speed as much as I do tend to increase it naturally with cueing. But and it ties into posture. But that's a longevity marker that's absolutely in the research where, if you're starting to lose gait speed as you get older, it's not a good set. It's not a good sign of, longevity and mortality.
Yeah, definitely.
Anything else to add to that? I mean, I think, again, doesn't need to be a long discussion, but an important discussion. And I would say impact control for me is one of those things that early on you can make a lot of change with just cueing, right? Yeah. Just, and I think it brings together the whole conversation about all the markers of control, because I think it's one of the easiest things to change for people is just how they're thinking about contacting a surface, right? Or posture might be a little more difficult, but if you teach someone to lighten their landings, a lot of times you are affecting their posture, and it might be the easier thing to attack as opposed to trying to tell somebody to like think about where their head is versus their shoulders and things like that. Or just land lighter for now. That's what we're gonna do, and that oftentimes works and cleans a lot of things up.
Yeah, no, I've seen that, and I think that really does end up sometimes being like a easier first step, because it also requires people sometimes to be a little bit less in their heads, and it's like instant feedback that they can feel if they're lighter.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's sort of the opposite end of the conversation we had about safety and pain, where it's very obvious to someone that landing lighter is safer, right? So it might not have been something that was brought up, right? Because it's also a little bit more effort than just collapsing into a chair, right?
Yeah.
But if you just bring it up, it tends to help. It usually decreases pain if you point it out, or if it's in the moment where pain is coming on. But it just makes a lot of sense that, oh yeah, that would be safer if I was able to just do it that way. So let me practice this, so it definitely gets that buy-in.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
All right, cool. So next week we're going to start looking at everything we talked about. Those are the markers of control. But now we're going to look at how do we add challenge to positions, and then eventually how do we add challenge to transitions, which will be a little bit of an extension of the conversation we've had about positions and transitions earlier on. But now it's going to start to look like exercises and fitness, and how, just this idea of progression from the easiest to ongoing advancement where it just there's no end game really.
Mm-hmm.
So positional challenges next week.
All right. Looking forward to it. I'll get my notes ready.
All right. See you then.
See you.
Thank you for listening to the Movement Professional Podcast. If you're finding the information useful and would like to support us, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts. If you have questions or suggestions for future content, feel free to send us a direct message on Instagram at MovementProf. That's at MovementProf. Or you can email us directly at chris@movementprofessional.com. If you're interested in more information regarding health, longevity, fitness, and performance, please check out Dr. Leib's books, Longevity Through Movement and Mobilize. Longevity Through Movement lays out an optimal plan for staying fit and healthy as you age, where Mobilize provides a framework for improving joint mobility throughout the body. Both books can be purchased at www.movementprofessional.com/book. That's www.movementprofessional.com/book. Thanks, and see you next time.